This is the Asia Trade. I'm Shery in Tokyo.
And I'm Paul Allen in Sydney. The top stories this hour. Talking trade. More than a month after the Trump tariffs were unveiled, top US and Chinese officials will meet for negotiations in Switzerland, led by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and China's Vice Premier Haidi. That news sending US futures higher, with a Chinese briefing on further economic support also set to boost sentiment. Bonds rallying for a second day ahead of the Fed's decision. But geopolitical uncertainty flaring again as India strikes what it calls terrorist camps in Pakistan, with Islamabad vowing retaliation. We speak live with Pakistan's Defence Minister in just a moment. Shery.
Take a look at how we're setting up for the Asian market opens. Of course, we do have Japan and Korea coming back on holidays. We could get that boost given, of course, the news over the U.S.-China trade talks, the first that have been confirmed so far. Take a look right now at Nikkei futures pointing to the upside, together with China A50 futures up 0.8%. We do have the offshore yuan at the moment gaining ground against the U.S. dollar as well. We had seen the Japanese yen also weaken after the news of the China-U.S. trade talks happening in Switzerland this week. Take a look at how we're setting up U.S. futures. We had seen 2 sessions of losses already on Wall Street, given, of course, the uncertainty over the trade negotiations. Right now, futures pointing to the upside. We had seen also the Bloomberg dollar index rebounding a little bit, given, of course, that we had seen significant weakness already, not only on the greenback, but just dollar-denominated assets, Paul.
Well, let's get the latest on how markets are reacting to the breaking news. We do have India saying it has attacked 9 sites in Pakistan and Pakistani Kashmir on Wednesday. Pakistan reporting 3 people dead, 12 injured. Bloomberg's David Ingles joins us now with some reaction. David, what are we seeing to all this breaking news, not just out of India and Pakistan, but China as well?
Yeah, there are lots of major assets that we're tracking that we don't normally see these types of moves this early in the day. And I think the point that Shery was making there with the initial pricing we're seeing is that most assets, most risk proxies are actually pointing to the upside. So it does seem on the trade conversation between the two happening, and I think Min will talk more about this in a moment, happening at nearly the highest possible level, excluding the heads of state. That's really what I think when you look at dollar China, for example, reacting really more to the news and announcement of the trade talks and not so much the briefing, which is equally as big, if not bigger. We'll see what they say before the markets open. As you can see, dollar China 719. That's a level that we haven't seen in a couple of days. That's actually testing the lows that we hit about 3 days ago. We'll watch it very, very closely today. We're looking at U.S. futures. Japan, as Shery pointing out, it's broadly a risk-on tone that's coming across these markets on the back of momentum from the trade conversations. Now, the other thing I want to point out, though, and, just to mention the breaking news a few hours back, and visually on India futures, before they shut about an hour ago, you do see when that headline hit of military strike. So this is a market we will be watching separately, but also very closely. 2% down going into the session today. Shery, lots of market strands today.
Bloomberg's David Ingles there, and of course we'll continue to follow what's happening in Pakistan. We have heard from the information minister now saying that 3 Indian jets and 1 Indian drone have been shot down. We actually do have the Defence Minister, Khawaja Mohammad Asif, joining us on the phone. Minister, great to have you with us, and thank you so much for taking the time. We have heard about what Pakistan has done. We are, of course, talking about an escalation here when it comes to the conflict with India. How far could this conflict go?
Well, let me give you the latest count. We have downed 5 Indian planes. Pakistan Air Force has shot down 5 Indian planes and multiple UAVs. And there are checkposts on the control line. A couple of checkposts have been destroyed. And some from Indian soldiers have been also taken prisoners. So this is the latest as for what is happening on the control line or international border between India and Pakistan. As for the attacks of Indian Air Force are concerned, on 7 different locations, 2 in independent Kashmir, 1 in Muzaffarabad, other Kotli, and 5 other locations in Pakistan, giving this impression that these places had terrorist camps. Well, I have, invited the international media and our local media to visit all these places and see for themselves if there are any terrorist camps or terrorist outfits on these locations. The civilian population has suffered. A lady has been martyred, a child has been martyred, and few other, casualties have been suffered by Pakistan, civilian casualties. And 2 mosques have been destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So this
the
is the
question
latest,
for our international
count.
viewers. The question right now that's hanging here is, how far is Pakistan willing to go here?
It all depends upon this. This has been initiated by India. If India is ready to back down, they have taken the initiative. We have just responded. We have been saying all along in the last fortnight that we'll never initiate anything hostile towards India. But if we are attacked, we'll respond. If India backs down, we will definitely wrap up these things, But as long we are under attack, under fire, we have to respond. We have to defend ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Minister, is there any contact between yourself and the Indian side at the moment?
I'm not aware of it, I'm not aware of it. If there is contact normally during these hostile, activities and tensions, there are backdoor contacts available anywhere in the world. There is, but I'm not aware of any contact between India and Pakistan at the moment.
Are you also concerned that India suspended the Indus River Treaty? Flows from the Chenab River into Pakistan have been restricted. Do you anticipate that continuing, or is there some talk to at least restore river flows to Pakistan?
I think World Bank brokered this treaty way back in 1960, which is now, 65 years old treaty. And it has worked reasonably well, not excellent, but reasonably well over the years. We have faced problems, but that still work here. But India now is seriously violating this treati. For any outflow or any downstream towards Pakistan, because we are a low riparian country, it has to be under the treaty. We have to be notified that this much water has been released from such and such location, and we should take care of that. In last 4 or 5 days or a week, there were releases of water. Without any warning, and then there was stoppage of water also without any more warning. So this flip-flop situation is going on for last about 8-9 days. And the treaty is being violated by India almost on daily basis. World Bank can intervene. They brokered this treaty, and we can talk to them with the Indians as far IWT is concerned. But
Minister,
under the circumstances, yes, go ahead, please ask.
No, please finish your thought. Under these circumstances?
Under these circumstances, when we are eyeball to eyeball, our forces, both countries are facing each other on the line of control, on international boundary, on working boundary. Under these circumstances, I think once the peace returns, this treaty can be enforced again. And if there is a need of any negotiations between India and Pakistan, World Bank can play a very significant role in that. That can be done.
So,
but under the present
Minister,
circumstances, yes, please go ahead.
And it sounds to us that you're willing to have contact with India, that you want to talk. Does that mean that you will carry out negotiations before there's another escalation on your side? When you say you already shut down jets, when you already took soldiers, is that the extent of what Pakistan is willing to do before there is a conversation with India?
You must understand that these are not hostile acts. We are just defending our territory, because India's incursions over last, let's say, 5 hours or 6 hours, I think around 11:30 or 12 o'clock or maybe after midnight, it all started. So we are just responding. If these hostile acts are stopped or they cease to continue these acts against Pakistan, we will definitely talk to India, and we do not want this situation to escalate. But if we are forced to respond, if there are hostile acts initiated from Indian side, then we have to respond. We cannot just sit back and take whatever is coming to us.
So, you've also been speaking to the U.S. What we understand is that you've been speaking to Secretary Rubio. Have you talked to Washington after these attacks from India? And what about Beijing? How does China play into this conflict?
Well, China is definitely, they are the third party to Kashmir. A part of Kashmir is with China also. So this is something I think China is a very, very relevant player in the region. Very, very relevant player. They can use their influence. I don't know whether it will work with India or not. But beyond China, if other countries in the region, like in the Arabian Gulf or Russian Federation, or President Trump has spoken just a couple of hours back, and he called this act of Indian aggression a shame. So President Trump, has been since he has taken over presidential office in the United States, he has been talking of conciliations and reconciliations and a peaceful world. He's talking about. He can also play a very significant role in bringing the two countries to halt the hostilities.
Minister, part of the reason the world is so concerned with this conflict is because your nation and India are both nuclear armed. How do you prevent this conflict from escalating before either country starts talking about nuclear deterrence?
Well, this is a huge risk. When two nuclear powers are confronting each other. And we do not have any intention of using a nuclear option. That is just something which guarantees our sovereignty, especially when we have next door a neighbor who is extremely hostile towards us. 77 years of our relationship, neighborhood. Is a witness or evidence to the fact that India has been hostile, and not only on the western eastern border, the border between India and Pakistan. They have their proxies working against us from Afghanistan, both in our province of Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan also. So they have their proxies trained and financed by India. So we are victims of aggression from both sides of by the Indians. One directly they engage in hostility with us, and other is through their terrorist proxies.
All right, Pakistan's Defence Minister Khawaja Mohammad Asif, thank you so much for joining us today. Bloomberg News is also reaching out to Indian officials for comment as well. Let's turn to our other top story. Top US and Chinese officials will meet this week to begin formal trade negotiations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will lead a US team with the Vice Premier Haidi heading the Chinese delegation in Switzerland. So we have Scott Bessent saying that they will be heading to Switzerland, hopefully in the next couple of weeks to begin talks. Let's get to Bloomberg Politics editor Romy Vajiz and our China correspondent Min Lo. Romy, I want to start with you. What are the expectations for these talks? Where do we set the bar?
I think the fact that these talks are happening is a huge development. I must remind everyone, this is the first confirmed trade talks between the two countries. And obviously, what is happening between China and the United States has been concerning investors. I mean, earlier today, stocks in the United States fell based on Trump's comments earlier saying that the U.S. is losing nothing by not trading with China. So the fact that these talks are happening is a significant development. And indeed, you see stock futures in the United States moving higher on this.
And maybe a significant development that the Chinese side is willing to acknowledge the conversations are happening. So what can we expect to be the bar for China when it comes to these negotiations?
Yeah, I think it's really significant. Two things. One, I think this is one of the few times we have coordinated messaging from U.S. and China, both sides releasing their statement around 6 a.m. local Beijing time, acknowledging that these trade talks are happening. And secondly, you have officials at the very top level, because China is fielding He Lifeng, which is the vice premier. If you remember, the first trade deal was negotiated by the vice premier at that time, Liu He, who signed the phase one trade deal with President Trump. So this is a very high level official that is going to be overseeing these talks with Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer. And the Chinese Commerce Ministry released a statement, a pretty long one, reiterating that China's stance hasn't changed at all. It's open to dialogue, yes, but if the U.S. wants to fight, it is still going to fight till the end, and China is not going to compromise on its principles. It will be defending its legitimate rights and interests. And that statement also came with a warning for other countries looking to negotiate with the U.S., saying that, quote, appeasement cannot be exchanged for peace. Compromise is not respected. Adhering to principled positions and fairness and justice is the right way to safeguard one's own interests. And the statement also saying that China will continue to open up, to share its development opportunities with the rest of the world. It's willing to work with other countries to jointly oppose hegemony, protectionism, and bullying.
Romy, when it comes to these trade negotiations, we have heard President Trump talk about not wanting that back and forth approach, that he'll be prescribing tariffs to other countries and that they should either accept or not. Do you expect that approach to actually work on Beijing, or will he take a two-way approach, given that really China has remained defiant so far?
I think this is going to be a tricky situation, and that's why you see Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer starting these talks. During his comments today with the new Canadian Prime Minister, Trump made it clear that he is the final arbiter of all trade deals. And indeed, he said he did not want this back and forth negotiation. But I would also note that Scott Bessent earlier today, when he spoke to lawmakers on Capitol Hill, he talked about how things were progressing. He talked about how talks were progressing with other nations. So Trump is aware that that markets are watching, but he also wants to stick to his tenet that he is the one who makes the deal, and he needs to see something significant happen with China because he feels that China has treated the United States very unfairly.
Min, China's not just going to be talking to the US. We've also got news that President Xi Jinping is going to be heading to Moscow for talks with Russia as well. What's on the table here, and to what degree does this offer China some extra leverage when it comes to speaking with the US?
Yeah, so President Xi going to Russia at this time when we have seen this backdrop of an international alliance sort of shifting, with President Trump also courting Putin to push for that ceasefire in Ukraine. This is a trip for China to establish that U.S.-China ties remains ironclad despite that sort of courting from President Trump so far. And President Xi is there to support Russia to attend the parade marking Soviet Union's win over Nazi Germany during World War II. And this is a mutual sign of support because the Kremlin also said that Putin has agreed to visit Beijing in September to mark China's win over Japan during World War II as well. Both sides about to sign bilateral documents as well as release a joint statement that's, according to the Kremlin, they will be discussing U.S.-Russia ties as well as the Ukraine war, as well as economic and energy issues, given the threat that Russia is facing from Europe now, the prospect of Europe cutting off their energy ties with Russia. And we know Russia has been diverting a lot of its energy supply to China, while China handed that economic lifeline to Russia. So both sides also, according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from China, both sides jointly opposing hegemony and bullying, again coming together to oppose or to create that multipolar world order that they want to see.
And Romy, before we let you go, what's the state of the trade negotiations between President Trump and other countries? We just heard that negotiation with Mark Carney with Canada went very well, according to the president.
Yes, I would refer to my earlier statement about Scott Bessent actually predicting that a trade deal could happen as early as this week with nations other than China. And he even said that 80 to 90% of trade deals could happen this year. So Scott Bessent is putting an optimistic tone on negotiations, while Donald Trump is insisting that he's not going to do a back and forth on negotiations.
Romy Verghese and our China correspondent Mimi Lo there with the latest. Right, Paul, of course, we do have breaking news at the moment.
Yeah, let's just take a look at how markets are responding to this very heavy news flow that we've had this morning. Of course, not just those talks imminent between the US and China. We have Scott Bessent saying that we don't want a decoupling with China. Talks are going to be about de-escalation as well, and China has been the missing piece in negotiation. We're also taking a look at, of course, that escalation between Pakistan and India. The Pakistan Defence Minister a short time ago saying that it has shot down a number of Indian jets and drones as well, taken a number of Indian Indian soldiers prisoner. Let's take a look at how Nikkei futures are shaping up ahead of the open. Of course, Japan's been off for a couple of days. We've got futures at the moment off by about 0.25%, I beg your pardon. These Nikkei futures traded out of Chicago, currently reporting higher by about 1%. S&P futures higher as well. We're just about 30 minutes away from the open here in Australia. Picture looking kind of flat at the moment, Shery.
Yeah, and this as Japan and South Korea coming back from holidays, right? And they will need to play catch up to all of the market gyrations that we've seen since then, especially with the dollar seeing significant weakness over the last few days. Although for the last session, we actually saw a little bit of a boost after 2 sessions of losses. On the other side of that trade, we have seen the Asia dollar index now gain to the highest levels in around 6 months or so. The Japanese yen had also strengthened in the previous session, but we actually had a little bit of weakness given the latest news when it comes to the U.S.-China trade negotiations.
All right, well, let's get some more on AMD numbers. Let's get to our tech reporter now, Annabelle Jewellers in Hong Kong. So, Belle, we had some strong revenue forecasts. What's the outlook for revenue and market share as well from AMD?
Yeah, so AMD, we had numbers out in the last couple of hours, and actually it's been sort of interesting in late trade because initially we saw the stock slumping and then it's actually recovered and it's now trading more than 1% to the upside. So the company essentially is saying, well, a couple of different things. We can kick off with something that's been a weaker point for them, and that's them talking about their China sales essentially, and that really is one of the chief concerns for investors. It is that tariff impact for the business. And so AMD is saying that they're going to be losing about $1.5 billion in revenue this year, given those US restrictions on exports to China. It's specifically going to be affecting the M1308 chip. But despite that, Lisa Su, the CEO there, is still optimistic about AI demand, and that as well played into the first quarter sales because we saw them rising 36% to $7.4 billion, and that did top estimates, particular gains that we saw in data center processors and also PC-related sales as well.
And Bill, we had NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang also speaking about China today.
Yeah, that's right. Jensen Huang making time not just for one, but two conferences today. But as part of that, he was actually speaking in an interview with CNBC earlier on Tuesday, talking about the market for AI chips in China. And he's saying that that could reach $50 billion in the next couple of years. And so his big argument is that it's essential for NVIDIA to have access to a market of this size. And that is really what helps NVIDIA and the US in turn maintain their competitive edge. He also later, a couple of hours later, was at Milken, and we've been just recapping some of those headlines as well at that event. But he's talking more macro around the amount of revenue and the amount of growth that AI can create as well. And so really not shying away from that kind of routine argument that he's had, that AI isn't going to be something that takes your job will be taken by someone using AI, and so that everyone should go out and essentially use these tools like ChatGPT.
Bloomberg's Annabelle Drewler's there. And other stories that we're tracking on the corporate front, Bloomberg has learned that the Qatar Investment Authority, Sinopec, and Hillhouse Investment are considering investing in CATL's Hong Kong listing. The Chinese battery maker already secured approval for the listing and has started gauging interest. The IPO could raise about $5 billion, making it Hong Kong's biggest debut since Kuaishou Technology in 2021. Rivian says full-year deliveries will decline more sharply than it anticipated a month ago, citing the impact of tariffs. However, the company still expects to achieve a modest full-year gross profit. Rivian now expects to sell up to 46,000 battery-powered vehicles this year. It says President Trump's trade policies risk worsening an existing slowdown in EV demand. We have more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
It's been a very busy morning in terms of news. Let's get you to what's been happening in India and Pakistan. We have just, of course, been speaking to the Pakistani Defence Minister, Asif. He says that Pakistan has shot down 5 Indian planes, taken a number of Indian soldiers prisoner as well. No immediate response from the Indian government at the moment. It is, of course, still very early in the morning in India and Pakistan. Indian government officials had previously described this as having briefed a number of countries, including the US, UK, Saudi Arabia and Russia, about the steps earlier taken from India. Pakistani airspace, meanwhile, closed for 48 hours after the Indian strikes. Haven't had any announcement regarding that from the Indian side. Pakistan's Defence Minister Asif also says they have had no diplomatic contact with India that he is aware of. He also says if India backs down, Pakistan will also wrap up its action as well, and they are open for talks with India also, Shery.
Yeah, we'll be watching the India markets when they open, of course, as the Pakistan Defence Minister just made sure to say to us that they don't want to escalate the situation, but of course that they cannot back down. Take a look at how we're setting up for the market opens, because we do have Japan and South Korea coming back online after holidays. The Japanese yen actually weakened after a couple of sessions of gains against the U.S. dollar. We had news, of course, of the U.S.-China trade negotiations, the first confirmed trade talks that will happen in Switzerland later this week. Nikkei futures still pointing to the downside and reversing some of those earlier gains. U.S. futures at the moment pointing to the upside after they fell in the previous session. Of course, we are waiting the Fed rate decision as well. Here in Japan, we'll be watching one sector of the market, and that's pharmaceuticals. The global pharma industry continues to grapple with an uncertain outlook after President Trump said a decision on pharmaceutical tariffs will be announced over the next 2 weeks. Our next guest runs Japanese drug maker Astellas Pharma, which is best known for cancer drugs, including Xtandi for prostate cancer. The company recently reported fourth quarter results, which beat estimates. With us now is CEO Naoki Okamura. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you again.
Congratulations, first of all, on your latest results. Xtandi, we have seen some changes in U.S. Medicare systems. Where are you expecting growth to come for this drug?
Yes. Xtandi is still growing in every region all over the world. But the U.S., we have the Medicare Part D redesign impact, which started at the January 1st this year. So the FY 2020 fiscal year 2024, we had only 1 quarter effect, but we have to have the full year effect for the next fiscal year. But we believe that Xtandi still grow in other countries outside of the U.S. So overall, it's in the stable situation.
The problem right now is other countries around the world, given how complicated the trade situation is,
Exactly.
right? Mm-hmm. How is Astellas preparing for these potential tariffs on the pharma sector?
Yes. So, it is too premature, and it is rapidly changing day by day. So we are running some scenario planning type of models, but it is too premature to speculate what exactly the impact of the tariff.
Where do you produce the most?
All over the world.
All over the world,
Yes.
Okay, because we are also thinking about currency effects as well, right?
Yes.
With the weakening of the U.S. dollar. Mm-hmm. How does that affect your business?
Of course, our reporting currency is Japanese yen. So, weaker Japanese yen, actually increases our revenue as well as the profit, the vice versa. So, if the yen continues to, appreciate it, that has the negative impact on our revenue as well as the profit.
Naoki, it's Paul Allen here in Sydney. You're also dealing with an activist investor in the shape of Farallon Capital. Seems to have built quite a large position in your company. Can you tell us about the sorts of discussions you're having with them at the moment?
Yes, we continue to engage with our stockholders as well as the investors. And we don't make any comments about the specific dialogue with one of our investors. But we are pleased that one of the most prominent investors like Farallon really sees the potential value in Astellas. So we have been we have the dialogue with any investors as well as the shareholders on a regular basis.
Yeah, I understand that you wouldn't want to share details of any conversations you're having with them on global television, but do you have any sense of some sort of shareholder proposals that you might be receiving at the next annual general meeting?
We haven't received any shareholder proposal for this year's annual shareholders meeting. I don't know what's coming, but so far we haven't received any shareholder proposal.
We have seen Farallon, when they engaged with Toshiba, for example, that it involved the election of directors to the board and some big changes over there. Are those some of the things that Astellas could entertain as sort of the things that they want to change?
I think, based on our dialogue, of course, we, take any advice, into our management, plan. So if it, really increases the company value, we would be happy to listen to their, opinion.
Are you talking to them more because they've been engaged since 2020, right?
Yes, and no, actually the frequency is on a regular basis. Most of the time, after the earnings calls and any significant announcement that we made.
Let's talk a little bit more about your products, because we know that last time you were here, we were talking about the non-hormonal drug for hot flashes, menopausal drug, Veozah, I think. How is that drug doing so far? And we've also seen that the FDA now wants a big warning when it comes to potential liver damage on the packaging. How much could that affect your business?
Yeah. Veozah, we unfortunately downgraded our, long-term forecast for Veozah, but, after that, the product is, running on track. And even after the, black box warning, we still see, increase in the prescription for the, women with the, vasomotor symptoms for menopausal women.
So that's in the U.S. Are you thinking of development here in Japan, and would that work?
Yes, we are running clinical studies in Japan.
Are the regulations different in Japan?
Yes, a little bit.
When it comes to potential warnings that could go into place?
That's a different story.
What about the cultural mindset that we talked about last time, right? I mean, menopause is a big deal that is not talked about as much. Do you think the cultural atmosphere in Japan will continue to change?
I think so, because, compared to, say, 30, 50 years ago, because the women are in the social situation a lot. So when it comes to working life balance and how women can contribute to society, probably the situation will dramatically change in the future.
Yes, this is something that we should be talking about a lot, menopause. What about other drugs in the pipeline that you're optimistic about? Where do you see future growth?
Yes. So, we are facing the loss of exclusivity for Xtandi in a couple of years. And we have been preparing for replacing the Xtandi revenue with the 5 strategic brands. One is Veozah. Another one is Padcev for bladder cancer. Number 3 is Izervay for geographic atrophy for age-related macular degeneration. We have a long-standing Zospata, which is the acute myeloid leukemia drug. And last year, we launched Vyloy for gastric cancer in Japan, US, and Europe.
It's great to have you with us again. Thank you so much for coming into the studio. Of course, that's Naoki Okamura, CEO at Astellas Pharma, Paul.
All right, we've got some more developments on tariffs and trade talks. The EU plans to hit about $113 billion in US goods with additional tariffs if ongoing negotiations fail to yield a satisfactory result for the bloc. Sources say member states will consult on proposed retaliatory measures for a month before the list is finalised. Separately, the European Commission is sharing new proposals with the US this week, trying to kickstart negotiations. The UK and US are currently in intensive discussions about an economic agreement that would reduce the impact of some tariffs. The deal's a priority for Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and sources say a team of British officials are in Washington to negotiate terms this week. Starmer hopes to protect British industry from the impact of 25% levies on steel and cars. Meanwhile, Britain announced a major new trade deal with India on Tuesday as the UK seeks to deepen economic ties with other nations. The deal slashes tariffs on cosmetics, vehicles, alcoholic beverages and other goods as both sides look for wins to offset the disruption of President Trump's protectionist policies. The UK says it expects the agreement to boost bilateral trade by $33.6 billion a year. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Let's take a look at how currencies are tracking. Been a fair bit of activity in this space over the past 48 hours or longer. We've got the dollar spot index bucking recent trends, though. It's actually up about 0.25%. We've also got the Aussie dollar starting to edge higher following the news that US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and China Vice Premier He Lefeng is going to meet next week. in Switzerland to discuss trade. So some of these trade exposed currencies performing a little bit better. We've also got the offshore yuan inching up a little bit on that news, just below that 720 level at the moment. The yen, meanwhile, just above 143. So for more on this, let's get to Garfield Reynolds now, who leads the Markets Live Asia coverage. Garfield, some of the big movements that we've seen in these Asian currencies this week, is the ceiling in at this stage?
Yeah, I would think so, Paul. We're all still getting used to the idea that the trade war is bad for the US dollar. Treasury Secretary Bessent himself, coming into all of this, was anticipating that one of the things that would reduce the direct impact on the US economy of the tariffs was that the US dollar would appreciate as a result. Instead, it's gone the other way for a variety of reasons, one of which is that the Trump administration has really shone the spotlight on the idea that some currencies are too low against the dollar. So the Taiwan dollar was a prime candidate for an unwinding, not necessarily as rapid as what we got, but it's very undervalued on a real basis, real exchange rate, a real trade weighted basis. And the same goes for things like the won and the yen. So that means that when you've got signs that there might be some progress towards trade peace, both with China and with elsewhere, that removes some of the pressure for that appreciation. And we've seen the US dollar tick higher against classic havens that we've had in the trade war. So the yen, the Swiss franc, the euro, they're all weaker versus the dollar this morning. And you could expect that trend to some extent continue as we lead into these trade talks. How the talks develop, that's going to be then the question. And we're set up for potentially a very interesting Monday in the wake of those negotiations.
And Garfield, we also saw a very interesting divergence when it came to the offshore yuan and the onshore yuan, right? I mean, are we getting a feeling that the PBOC doesn't necessarily want to allow the currency to appreciate drastically for now?
Yeah, well, the PBOC's general operating procedure is to avoid sudden moves in the yuan. I think they still bear the scars of what happened way back in 2015 when they engineered a shift in the yuan and it got well and truly out of control. So they like a slow but steady pace, whichever way it's going to go. They also like to discourage speculators by avoiding one-way moves. We already had a lot of strength in the offshore yuan when the PBOC was on a break, accompanying also that Taiwan dollar move. So you're going to see, I think, the onshore yuan continue to strengthen a bit to sort of catch up with that move in the offshore yuan. But today we've got a pressure from the PBOC and other officials, and then we've got the fixing, and you've got these moves towards trade peace. With China insisting it doesn't want to sacrifice its principles, doesn't seem likely that they would countenance a rapid appreciation in the yuan, which could be seen as sort of giving away some of their cards going into the negotiations. And by the same angle, they're not likely to push back to try and get the yuan to fall, because if there is trade peace, then you don't need the yuan to fall in order to cushion the Chinese economy against the impact of the tariffs that for the moment are still in place. So a steady hand on the yuan, one that's likely to look to deaden volatility and keep that fix at around the 7.20 level, would seem to be likely.
There's one thing we haven't mentioned amid all the heavy news flow this morning, there's a Fed meeting happening as well. What potentially could we hear from the Fed that supports the US dollar?
Well, the most likely thing that would help to support the US dollar out of the Fed would be if they, if Jay Powell emphasises a relatively hawkish tone. There's been a flourishing of bets on the Fed cutting rates by 75 to 100 basis points this year. Some thought that June could be the meeting when that would happen, but we haven't heard from the Fed since those strong jobs numbers that came out on Friday, and the recent data that we've had, the hard data, have mostly emphasized the idea that the US economy retains some resilience. The more recent facing data, as it were, the soft data, which comes in closer to the actual collection, as it were, that's still signaling that the tariffs and other matters are weakening the US economy, but not so far that the Fed is going to feel the need it needs to cut or even signal that cuts are coming rapidly, especially because even with the talks going on, there's been a lot of damage to inflation expectations. There's plenty of concern that the tariffs, which aren't going to go away, even if they don't end up being as large as had been announced, that those will feed into price gains. So in that environment, the very strong expectation is the Fed will hold rates. It's not likely to signal a rapid move towards cutting them. The question for investors is, how strong is the pushback against those rate bets? How likely does it look that the Fed would cut rates in the second half year? Will there be any comments about, look, if the tariffs don't end up feeding into inflation, then we're already in a situation where we need to be on the lookout to cut rates if the economy shows signs of slowing? That sort of comment would actually be quite bad for the US dollar.
Bloomberg's Garfield Reynolds, good to have you with us. Of course, everything on the currency markets and what we can expect from the Fed at a time when, as we said, Japanese and South Korea markets set to open after a public holiday. This, of course, as we're still digesting what President Trump is saying. He says that he will dictate trade concessions for partners looking to avoid higher duties. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Bailey Lipschultz here in the Tokyo studio. Of course, you're swapping from New York, so it's great to have you here. Yeah, this is kind of weird, right? Because Japan and Korea have been away on holidays. They need to do a lot of catch up, but we're still trying to decipher what these trade talks mean.
No, a lot has changed, but nothing really has changed seemingly since Friday. Now it does seem like this is a big step towards talking about potentially easing some of the trade concerns that we've seen from China and the U.S. Obviously, closely watched meetings will be playing out later this week. The big question, though, has been how are investors positioning? As you mentioned, we did see rallies, broadly speaking, across APAC on Monday or Tuesday. Other regions were also closed, so a lot of catching up to do. But as we saw with futures pointing towards a stronger gain, a stronger open, that likely kind of on tandem of, all right, we saw positive updates over the weekend. We saw positive updates Monday and Tuesday. And certainly we are now starting to bake in the step forward for Scott Bessent making that trip and kind of potentially at least having a real conversation with China. And how does that fall and where do those chips fall for Japanese and South Korean investors? Seemingly more bullish right now, but we have a lot to go on in the next few days.
Because also when we got that headline, we actually saw the Japanese yen weaken and reverse some of those gains that we saw overnight. Given how these markets are so sensitive to currency gyrations, whether it's the Japanese yen or Korean won, what are some of the implications that we should be on the watch out for?
Well, seeing what levels on the Japanese yen, do we get back below 140? That's going to be closely watched when I talk to portfolio managers. That's top of mind. Obviously, the big question is a stronger yen benefits companies that produce and have more kind of domestic policies. But if you're someone who is a business that generates the majority of your profits and income through dollar denominated, then actually that does hurt you on the bottom line. So we are seeing potentially a bit of a bifurcation under the surface here in Japan. But the big question is if investors, foreign investors, are looking to redeploy capital to other regions, then actually a stronger yen does potentially, or at least historically, should draw some capital flows, at least from other regions and other money managers.
All right, Bloomberg's Bailey Lipschultz there. Time for morning calls ahead of the trading day in Asia. Billionaire investor Paul Tudor-Jones expects President Trump to reduce China tariffs by 50%, but he believes stock markets could still hit new lows. Jones told CNBC that Trump's tariffs are the largest tax increase since the 1960s. He says Trump's move to correct the trade imbalance was a great idea, but the execution could have been more precise. Jones adds that the Fed needs to cut rates to prevent market downturn. Matt Gibson of Goldman Sachs says the cone of uncertainty surrounding markets won't be closed until the first tariff deals are completed. When asked about which assets could do well amid the uncertainty, Gibson said investors could allocate some capital to investment-grade private credit or asset-backed finance. We have more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg. Some earnings reports that were following. National Australia Bank's latest earnings topped analyst expectations, and this comes as the firm's key unit of lending to businesses grew. Cash profit rose 1% to $2.3 billion in the first half of the year. CEO Andrew Irvin says while trade tensions are a key source of uncertainty, the bank is optimistic about the growth outlook for Australia and New Zealand. Singapore's UOB has withheld its 2025 guidance amid economic uncertainties. The move comes as the lender delivered first quarter profit that was marked by a rise in provisions. Net interest income rose 2%, while net fee income surged 20%. UOB says it remains committed to its $2.3 billion capital distribution plan.
Take a look at how we're setting up for the market opens across Asia, Japan, and Korea. Coming back from holidays. This, of course, as we may be playing a little bit of catch-up, given that we have also heard about U.S.-China trade talks that will happen in Switzerland this week. We had seen U.S. stocks falling in the overnight session, but futures also pointing to the upside. The market opens in Sydney, Seoul, and Tokyo are next. This is Bloomberg. This is the Asia trade. We're counting down to Asia's major market opens. And could we see some fireworks in today's session, Paul? Of course, Japan and South Korea coming back from public holidays. And just 2 hours ago, we heard about the first confirmed trade talks between the U.S. and China later this week in Switzerland.
Yes, and we've also had military action in the early hours of this morning in India and Pakistan. Pakistan claiming it's downed a number of Indian jets, taken Indian soldiers prisoner as well. And the United Kingdom now advising against travel to the India-Pakistan border area. So that geopolitical backdrop remaining as tense as ever, Shery.
We'll be watching the India markets when they open in just a few hours. But take a look at how Japan is coming online. We continue to see the Japanese yen losing ground against the U.S. dollar after news of the U.S.-China trade talks earlier today. We had seen significant strength in the past 3 sessions, but right now it's holding at that 143 level against the greenback. The Nikkei coming back online, 0.2% gains together with the Topix, which is up 0.4%. As we continue to watch, of course, all of the trade negotiations ongoing, not only between the U.S. and China, but Japan and its own trade negotiations with Washington as well. Take a look at how we're setting up for the Korean market opens, because the Kospi has actually gained ground for the last 2 weeks. And the market gyrations that we've seen in the currency space will be really felt in the Korean won. Right now at that 1376 level, a little bit of strength against the U.S. dollar. Of course, we had seen the Taiwan dollar surge earlier this week. We had seen Asian currencies rally earlier this week. So how that really affects the equity markets across Asia will also be a key question. Of course, a lot of those exporters could feel the pain, Paul.
Well, we've just opened for trade here in Australia, a staggered open, of course, so we have a bit of trouble getting a read on things at the moment, but in the early going, a little bit of positivity for the ASX. We're better by 0.1% right now. We've also seen the Aussie dollar strengthening on that news that the US and China will be holding preliminary talks in Switzerland on trade. Well, that's going to be happening later on this week. We've got the yields ticking up a little bit on the US 10-year in the early rally going. We have seen treasuries rallying in the US session. The 10-year yield fell a little bit. We do, of course, have a Fed decision this week as well. Markets are seeing the Fed on hold for now, but traders do see 3 25 basis point cuts coming later this year. Take a look at the oil price as well. It's been under a lot of pressure recently due to oversupply concerns, but it's rising today. Brent 62.70. It's up by about getting on for 1% at the moment. Of course, there is plenty of geopolitical tension against the conflict that we're seeing between India and Pakistan. Well, let's bring in Homan Lina. He's senior macro strategist at Lombard ODA. Homan, perhaps not surprising that in this environment you are overweight investment grade and government bonds as well. How would you describe your risk appetite right now, and can you see that changing?
Well, certainly the confirmation of the first engagement between the Trump team and Beijing should improve the risk appetite for the markets in the remainder of the week. But in our view, this volatile policy making in Washington, D.C. will continue to be a factor for the investors who are thinking about the market environment in the next 3 to 6 months. And for that reason, we still think it makes sense for the investors to maintain a portfolio level discipline, which for us means keeping the portfolio close to strategic asset allocation levels, but with a bit of tilt to defensive assets such as sovereign bonds and investment grade bonds. And the reason is that we still think we're not fully out of this period of uncertainty. For instance, for the Trump team, we're still waiting for the announcement of the sector tariffs on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, and also there are uncertainties related to the export controls for a data center business outside the U.S. For instance, this responsible diffusion announcement may be that will be delivered in the middle of the month. So overall, in an environment like this, we still think it makes sense for the investors to basically keep the portfolio level discipline, and this is what we're doing at the moment. So the risk appetite will probably improve a bit this week, but overall in the next few weeks, still not going to be easy to completely resolve these uncertainties.
How have recent moves that we've seen in foreign exchange markets been informing your investment decisions as well? Because if we take a look at the US dollar, I mean, yes, we have this encouraging narrative around trade this morning, but on the other hand, we do have the Fed expecting to remain hawkish this week also. So what do you see there?
So we have to acknowledge that the theme of U.S. exceptionalism is getting a genuine challenge, and for that reason, and part of this is quite justified. We, for instance, on our side, we have brought our outlook for the U.S. GDP growth from 2.4% at the start of the year to now just 1.2%. So the expectation of growth outperformance for the U.S. is definitely going away. And we have to acknowledge that. And we think the currency markets around the world are beginning to incorporate that. Now, what's unique about the Asia market is that many of these exporters were in the crosshairs of Trump's tariff imposition. And for that reason, maybe investors in the region were not as bullish on their own local currencies as opposed to the G10 currencies that have significantly outperformed up to mid-late April. But after the turmoil in the U.S. market that shifted the correlation between U.S. assets and U.S. dollar, and also this idea of potentially a currency accord being included in the bilateral trade deals for the countries with the U.S., that perception is beginning to shift, and this is what we are observing in the Asia market. Now, we cannot rule out the technical drivers. Early May is a hectic holiday season for Asia, and on top of that, a lot of institutional and retail investors were probably caught off guard. So that might have amplified the impact of the market chatter on the potential bilateral deals. But certainly, this is the environment we're in for the Asia currency markets.
But Homin, as you said, given that that idea of U.S. exceptionalism seems to be fading long term, if we do have a weaker U.S. dollar and stronger Asian currencies, how sensitive are Asian markets, Asian equity markets, to currency fluctuations, especially when you have a stronger won, a stronger yen in these like heavily export-dependent economies?
So that's definitely slightly negative on the margin. So in reaction to the currency market moves, what we want to see is some sort of a correction or capitulation in the Asia markets before we become quite aggressively bullish on these markets. We think the valuations now less demanding, for the Taiwan market in particular. But the stronger currency and possibility of sector tariffs that make the exports even less competitive for the key market of the U.S. is certainly an issue that needs to be coped with for the investors. So our thinking here is that we want to see some sort of clarity emerging in the bilateral trade talks with the U.S. first, and also a level of clarity for the sector tariffs before we adopt a more bullish stance on these East Asian equity market, and for that reason, we still maintain a neutral stance on them for the time being.
And we continue to see the tensions escalate between India and Pakistan. You did have a long India call earlier. Would this ongoing conflict affect how you view this market?
Well, certainly it's a modest setback, and we'll have to see how the conflict escalates from here. If you think about the India's fundamentals, excluding this new geopolitical development, it's certainly a market that's relatively immune to these trade disputes, and it seems unlikelier that the country might benefit from just a minimum 10% tariff like everyone else. Meanwhile, the country will be advantageously positioned compared to China in trading with the U.S., and we're beginning to see the shift away from China, especially in the lower and mid segment of the global manufacturing supply chain. We just heard about Apple's plans to change the assembly work completely from China to India, for instance. So the market, in our view, is quite favorably positioned. On top of that, RBI is easing into the environment where the dollar is relatively soft, so that helps. And the inflation picture is quite stable with the favorable monsoon forecast. Now, for the geopolitical conflict, it's a setback, but for the time being, we think these positive on the fundamental side will offset the geopolitical risk. However, if there's a very significant escalation of the disputes that potentially spreads, to the broader Indian economy, then we'll have to reassess. But we don't think we're there yet.
Ho-Min Lee, Senior Macro Strategist at Lombard Odier, good to have you with us. And as Ho-Min was telling us, that optimism about Indian markets, especially in the long term, has propelled this stock index, the benchmark Nifty, to the best performing market globally since President Trump announced those broad-ranging tariffs in April. So there could be some profit taking on the table at the moment. But of course, we continue to watch the geopolitical developments, with India conducting a targeted military strike against Pakistan to that militant attack that we saw in Kashmir that killed 26 people. In fact, we spoke to the Defense Minister of Pakistan earlier today. Take a listen to what he had to say.
This has been initiated by India. If India is ready to back down, they have taken the initiative. We have just responded. We have been saying all along in last fortnight that we'll never initiate anything hostile towards India. But if we are attacked, we'll respond. If India backs down, we will definitely wrap up these things, But as long we are under attack, under fire, we have to respond. We have to defend ourselves.
For more, Bloomberg government reporter Ben Westcott joins us now. And Ben, we heard from the defense minister that Indian jets were shot down as well. I mean, this conflict continues to escalate.
Yes, well, I guess we'll say from this point onwards, what the Pakistani Defence Minister said there was that he was prepared to not escalate the conflict further than the 5 planes that he said that has been shot down and the Indian soldiers who have been taken hostage, if India in return is happy to hold off on further escalation. So now in many ways we will be waiting to hear to see what exactly India's response to this escalation is and whether or not they are prepared to let this be talked out from this point onwards. Obviously, this is one of the most hotly contested parts of the world. India and Pakistan have a long history of tensions between the two countries. So the world will be watching very closely to see whether or not there is any escalation in this conflict.
Yes, and the minister also told us that so far there's no contact diplomatically that he's aware of between India and Pakistan. But are there other nations willing to help broker some sort of de-escalation here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've already seen Iran's foreign minister will be heading to Delhi and has already been to Islamabad in an attempt to negotiate some sort of peace between these two countries. Other countries are calling for relations to be as relaxed as possible, including the United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio. So there will be a number of countries reaching out to try and broker a ceasefire between India and Pakistan going forward. But at the end of the day, it will be down to those two countries to determine whether or not they are willing to lay down arms and avoid any further escalations.
Bloomberg's Ben Westcott there following the latest when it comes to the India-Pakistan conflict. Bloomberg News continues to reach out to Indian officials for comment as well. We have more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
The top US and Chinese officials will meet this week in Switzerland to begin formal trade negotiations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent will lead the US team, with Vice Premier He Feng heading the Chinese delegation. Bessent says everything is on the table. Let's bring in Bloomberg editor John Harney in DC and our China correspondent Min Lo. John, I want to start with you. When it comes to these talks, I mean, Scott Bessent also said the tariffs that the US has on China are unsustainably high, and certainly at 145%, it almost looks like performance at this point. If we were going to set a bar for these talks, where would it be? Fairly low, one imagines?
Probably, although we will have to see. The Secretary emphasized that this is more about de-escalation, which is something that has to be done before serious negotiations can begin on, reducing tariffs, ameliorating some of the barriers that have been established by the President Trump's policies and Beijing's policies. But let alone a formal trade agreement. So he was keeping expectations, I would say, minimalist, perhaps, at this point.
In the meantime, of course, China continues to try to beef up its economy. Min, what can we expect from that press briefing from financial authorities in Beijing?
Yeah, it's a very important press briefing given that all the big wigs are coming. You have the PBOC Governor Pang Gongsheng, the CSRC, which is the financial regulator, Wu Qing will be there as well. And this briefing was just announced yesterday afternoon, very last minute. And it brings to mind the last time such a thing happened was back in September last year, that big PBOC briefing, which was really key in turning around market sentiment. We had seen like these slew of really significant easing measures. Will we see the same thing today? That is a big question because the authorities have been very vague in announcing this press conference, simply saying that the topic will be on stabilizing market expectations. So, of course, we had the Politburo meeting earlier saying that China is preparing emergency plans. They are preparing financing measures, new policy tools to support specific sectors, in particular domestic consumption as well as tech and trade, the companies, especially small and medium exporters that are affected by the tariffs. So we'll be looking out for whether there'll be any new measures to support the economy, given the latest data that we have, the PMI data from Tyson yesterday, pointing to slowdowns in the second quarter onwards.
In the meantime, Washington is also keeping busy. John, we know that President Trump has already met with his Canadian counterpart, that the conversation went very well. What can we expect on other trade deal fronts with other partner countries?
Well, the administration and of course the Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bessent, are still seem very bullish on the prospect of agreements, accords, what have you, and the Secretary also was made this point that we as reporters, journalists, whatever, and others, even in the markets, don't know what the White House knows. In other words, that they have some cards up their sleeve at this point. But even in the meeting with Prime Minister Carie, it went, as you say, quite well. Given some of the rhetoric about making Canada 51st state and that sort of thing. But President Trump also said that the tariffs with Canada were not coming down.
Min, it's not just China, of course, that the U.S., not just the U.S. that China is meeting with. We also have President Xi Jinping heading to Russia for conversations as well. What is that about, and how does it set an interesting backdrop for those talks between the U.S. and China and Switzerland?
Yes, it's interesting, right, that you have on the one hand President Xi in Russia, and at the same time you have He Lifeng in Switzerland, a neutral country, meeting with the U.S. Representative Scott Bessent and Jamieson Greer for trade talks. And it's also interesting, given the recent sort of overtures from the U.S. to Russia to try to get Russia to wean off its reliance on China. Still, President Xi is making this trip to Russia in a show of mutual support. President Xi is there to attend a parade marking the Soviet Union's win over Nazi Germany during World War II. And in exchange, the Kremlin has announced as well that Putin will also be visiting China in September to mark China's win over Japan during World War II as well. A show of mutual support that both sides still have this ironclad friendship, a united front in the face of what they are calling this hegemonic sort of bullying from the U.S. Both sides will be issuing a joint statement. They'll be discussing things like U.S.-Russia relations, the Ukraine war, as well as, of course, economic and energy issues. We know Russia has been diverting a lot of its energy supplies to China. It has offered a big market for Chinese produce, and China, on the other hand, offered that economic lifeline to Russia amid all those sanctions as well.
Min, how much does all of this help President Xi Jinping's position when going into these trade negotiations with the U.S.? Because so far it's been really interesting that President Trump kept insisting that they were already having discussions, and China until now had resisted confirming those talks.
Yes, actually, for so many weeks, we have heard very different things from U.S. and Chinese officials. And this is the first time we are hearing coordinated messaging from both sides issuing statements at the same time at 6 a.m. Beijing time this morning, acknowledging that these trade talks are happening. And the fact that China also fielded a top-level official, Vice Premier He Lifeng, to oversee this, that is a good sign. But it is going to be very challenging talks because, as you said just now, that the tariffs are already at such prohibitive levels, 145%. There's an anchoring effect there, which means the U.S. can go in and say, let's, lower the tariffs by half, and they can tout a win. But then for China, then you are still left with 70-80% tariffs, which 6 months ago would have still been unthinkable. And China has insisted the U.S. needs to remove all unilateral tariffs. That has been their demand from the beginning. The Chinese Commerce Ministry is saying that regardless, the fact that they're going to talks, it doesn't change the fact that they are not going to compromise on their principles, on defending their legitimate rights and interests. And they are saying that given the U.S. started this, they need to show their sincerity in de-escalating.
Right. Bloomberg's John Carie as well as Mimi Lo there with the latest on the trade negotiations. We do have breaking news at the moment. We're hearing again from the Pakistan Defence Minister coming out and clarifying some of those comments that he made during our shows. He actually had told us that some Indian soldiers have been taken prisoner. The minister is now saying that no Indian soldier has been taken prisoner, and he just wanted to make a statement to clarify what he said earlier. Of course, he had told us on Bloomberg television that Pakistan had shot down 5 Indian planes. This, of course, after India conducted targeted military strikes against Pakistan because of that militant attack in Kashmir that killed 26 people. So again, the defense minister of Pakistan clarifying that no Indian soldiers have been taken prisoner. We have more ahead. This is Bloomberg. We're seeing broad upside across markets in Asia, Japan, and Korea coming back from public holidays. And you can see some of those semiconductor makers gaining ground. But this after AMD gave also a bullish sales outlook. We heard from the CEO, Lisa Su, remaining bullish on the overall demand for AI. The caveat, though, it expects to lose $1.5 billion in revenue this year because of U.S. restrictions on sales to China. Not to mention, of course, Paul, we also heard from Secretary Scott Bessent that he does want to bring back semiconductor, steel and medicines manufacturing to the U.S.
Well, let's check in on National Australia Bank here in Australia, having a pretty good day on the ASX. The index broadly flat. NAB, though, up by 3.6%. This is after announcing first-half cash profit, 3.58 billion Aussie dollars. That was a beat, up about 1% on year. Interim dividend of 85 cents. Bloomberg Intelligence is expecting to hear a second-half buyback announcement from NAB. So those shares higher at the moment in Australia. We've got more ahead on the Asia trade. This is Bloomberg.
Take a look at how currencies are trading right now. We'll continue to see the rebound in the U.S. dollar. On the other side of that trade, a little bit mixed. We are seeing a little bit of strength for the offshore yuan at the moment. This, of course, after pressure in the previous session, as we had seen some signals from the PBOC about the reluctance to allow drastic yuan appreciation. On the other hand, the Japanese yen is under a little bit of pressure after we heard the news about the first confirmed the U.S.-China trade talks that are happening in Switzerland later this week. Not a lot happening with the Aussie, but we continue to watch those emerging market currencies because we have seen the Asian currency space rally with the Asian dollar index now at around the highest levels in about 6 months. A lot to do with the currency gyrations, what's happening with the Taiwanese dollar, right? The first 2 trading sessions of the month of May, gains of 6%. This recent surge now putting that spotlight on concerns about the U.S. dollar's dominance and its potential structural decline. Bloomberg Opinion columnist Shery Ren says the great dollar unwind has arrived. She joins us now from the Hong Kong studio. Shery, so is this the end of U.S. exceptionalism as much as it's reflected on the greenback?
Well, there's certainly a lot of worry about it, especially in Asia. In recent conversations with investors in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taipei that I had, people were referring to the chair of Council of Economic Advisor, Steve Myron's November paper, in which he talked about dollar overvaluation 10 times. People are really worried because in Asia, we all know a lot of Asian countries are export-oriented. They have hoarded a lot of dollar, and they have not hedged their currency exposure, right? So when investors and traders start to feel that they need to repatriate their proceeds back into their local currencies, that's when the king dollar, the dollar exceptionalism starts to falter.
Shery, in your column, you gave a very timely shout-out to Warren Buffett and, of course, his favourite line, when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. Well, this week we found out Taiwanese life insurers were swimming naked. Who else in the region is doing the same thing?
I mean, a lot of people so UBS in the March report, they talked about just among G10 countries alone, there are about 13.7 trillion US dollars of unhedged foreign holdings, and 2/3 of them are in the U.S. equities, and 1/3 is in the fixed income. I mean, a lot of Chinese exporters, they have been swimming naked, right? They earn their dollar and they are parking their money in Hong Kong, and they're now repatriating their money back into the Chinese yuan, and that's what we are seeing. Like a Hong Kong Monetary Authority had to scramble, and 2 days ago they spent $8 billion US dollars to purchase US dollar and keep their peg. A lot of institutions and exporters have been swimming naked.
Actually, when we saw the Taiwanese dollar just surge, there was also speculation that perhaps this is an economy that will allow the currency to gain ground, especially when they're in the middle of trade negotiations with the U.S. What are the geopolitical implications and overlay in what's happening in the currency space?
Yeah, it's interesting because the central bank came out and to quell the speculation, said it was total nonsense. But it's not. It's kind of reasonable in a way because late April, the South Korean government actually talked about like exchange rate is one of the 4 pillars that they were going to discuss with the White House in their effort to reach a trade deal. So everyone knows that the White House wants to put currencies and the currency valuations on the table. So I mean, the speculation is not completely ungrounded. You know what I mean?
Bloomberg Shery, really good to have you with us. We want to discuss a little bit more what this means for the trajectory of Asian currencies. Let's bring in Carie, global market strategist at DBS Bank Hong Kong. Carie, really good to have you with us. We were talking about some of that fundamental waning of U.S. exceptionalism as reflected in the U.S. dollar, but also that geopolitical angle that the currency markets may be facing right now. At the end of the day, is it sort of inevitable at this point that we might see more dollar weakness?
Well, I think for the Trump's policy uncertainty, it's not only hurting the economic outlook of the U.S., but also hurting the credibility of the U.S. government as well as the independence of the Federal Reserve. As a result, markets are concerned about the long-term role of the U.S. dollar and sought to continue the de-dollarization trend, and now the de-dollarization is spreading from the safe haven currencies towards the Asian currencies. We are also turning rather bearish on the U.S. dollar in the longer term.
And what does longer term mean? Where will we be at the end of the year?
For the dollar index at the end of the year, we are expecting to see the dollar index probably falling towards the 96 level.
What does that mean then for the other side of the current of that trade, for example? Sorry, Paul, I just wanted to ask about what happens to the other side of that trade, especially when you have the likes of the Japanese yen, for example, that are just bound to so many other different market dynamics, including what's happening with the Bank of Japan.
Well, for the Japanese yen, actually, we are seeing further upside going forward because for Japanese yen, actually, it has been undervalued based on the BRS rear or near. And even though the BOJ is not going to be in a rush to hike their interest rates, if the other central banks, especially the Federal Reserve, is going to cut interest rate, there will be a narrower yield differential supporting the yen going ahead. Now the problem with the Japanese yen is very crowded net long positions, probably capping the near-term upside of it. And we are seeing the dollar yen probably being limited at around 140, but in the longer run, or probably in the second half of this year or into next year, we will see further upside for the yen.
So if the yen's looking undervalued right now, which other currencies in Asia are looking undervalued to you?
Basically, if we're talking about the BIS near or rear, a lot of Asian currencies are undervalued, and the renminbi is one of the example. But to us, we think probably it's still not the time for the PBOC to allow much further strength in the renminbi, because even though we have this tariff war de-escalation, and probably there will be some trade talks, but to strike a deal, it takes some time, and unless the tariffs are totally removed, it's likely to still have some impact of the tariffs on Asian economy as well as China's economy. And in that case, to reflect this kind of impact, the PBOC may still want to have a stable renminbi instead of allow excessive gain in the yuan. So that's the reason why from the daily fixing rate, we're still seeing a signal from the PBOC that they want their currency to be stable. So for the other Asian currencies that may be undervalued as well, there could also be limited upside in the near term because of the limited upside of the renminbi at this moment.
Currencies, of course, an important tool when it comes to addressing some of these trade imbalances with the US, and we do have talks coming up between the US and China. To what degree, in the course of those discussions, do you think China would be willing to let the yuan appreciate?
I think to China, different from the last round of trade war, actually this round, they are not really allowing the renminbi to have significant depreciation. Maybe they are taking a different approach this time round. And when we have this very high tariff hike, actually the dollar CNH still being capped around 7.4, and also from the fixing rate, we also see a very managed depreciation for the CNY as well as CNH, as signaled by the PBOC. So going ahead, we are also not very likely to see the PBOC allow excessive downward move for the renminbi as well as the upward move of the renminbi. They would rather keep the currency stable with two-way movement and two-way volatility.
All right, Carie Lee, Global Market Strategist at DBS Bank in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining us today. Well, Friedrich Merz has won a parliamentary vote to become Germany's new Chancellor on his second try after a shock loss in the first round. He's the first incoming Chancellor since World War II who has failed to get enough votes the first time around. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook has more from Berlin.
After a day of political upheaval here in Germany, the nation finally has a new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. This was supposed to be a procedural process. This was supposed to be brought before the parliament. They were supposed to vote, and then the new Chancellor was to be sworn in. That is not what happened. In the very first hours, in the very first stumbling block, the parliament failed to get that majority, and Friedrich Merz's future as the Chancellor of Germany was put on hold. That led lawmakers and journalists alike to grab for the German constitution, because this has literally never happened, in order to understand procedurally how to go forward. They later held a vote later in the afternoon, and Friedrich Merz finally was able to pass and be announced and elected Chancellor of Germany. And this was supposed to be a moment in which you end the political upheaval of the last government, which fell prematurely back in November, and to usher a new age of German stability and able to deal with the litany of issues that lie before the German economy. Whether it's the fact that it's been in contraction for the last 2 years, whether it's the fact that there are these tariffs coming from Donald Trump, the question of foreign policy and the lack of leadership within Europe, Friedrich Merz really wanted to cast himself as that strong leader of Germany and potentially within Europe. And he comes into the office now with great doubts about how strong this coalition is and how effective they're going to be at governing, particularly with the deployment of that 1 trillion euros worth of debt finance assets to build out infrastructure and to build out the defense industry. How certain are they that they're going to have the agreements in order to effectively deploy that capital in a day that was supposed to bring political stability into Germany? Really has brought a lot of sort of chaos and a lot of sort of doubt about the future of this coalition government.
Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Berlin. We have more developments on tariffs and trade negotiations, with the EU also planning to hit about $113 billion in U.S. goods with additional tariffs if ongoing negotiations fail to yield a satisfactory result for the bloc. Sources say member states will consult on proposed retaliatory measures for a month before the list is finalized. The UK and US are set to be in intensive discussions about an economic agreement that would reduce the impact of some tariffs. Sources say a team of British officials are in Washington this week to negotiate terms. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is aiming to protect British industry from the impact of 25% levies on steel and cars. Meanwhile, the UK has announced a major new trade deal with India as it seeks to deepen economic ties with other nations. The deal slashes tariffs on cosmetics, vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and other goods. The UK says it expects the agreement to boost bilateral trade by $33.6 billion a year. European futures looking to the upside. This is Bloomberg.
Let's get to some stories that we're tracking on the corporate front. Bloomberg has learned that the Qatar investment authorities, Sinopec and Hillhouse Investment, are considering investing in CATL's Hong Kong listing. The Chinese battery maker already secured approval for the listing and has started gauging interest. The IPO could raise about $5 billion. That would make it Hong Kong's biggest debut since Quayshow Technology in 2021. Rivian says full-year deliveries will decline more sharply than it anticipated a month ago, citing the impact of tariffs. However, the company still expects to achieve a modest full-year gross profit. Rivian now expects to sell up to 46,000 battery-powered vehicles this year. It says President Trump's trade policies risk worsening an existing slowdown in EV demand. National Australia Bank's latest earnings topped analyst expectations, and this comes as the firm's key unit of lending to businesses grew. Cash profit rose 1% to $2.3 billion in the first half of the year. CEO Andrew Irvine says while trade tensions are a key source of uncertainty, the bank is optimistic about the growth outlook for Australia and New Zealand. Singapore's UOB has withheld its 2025 guidance amid economic uncertainties. The move comes as the lender delivered first quarter profit that was marked by a rise in provisions. Net interest income rose 2%, while net fee income surged to 20%. UOB says it remains committed to its $2.3 billion capital distribution plan. Shery.
Right. We continue to hear from the Pakistan Defence Minister. We spoke earlier here on Bloomberg Television how Pakistan had shut down Indian jets. He's again clarifying that no Indian soldiers have been taken as prisoners. This, of course, after India conducted the military strikes against Pakistan in response to that militant attack in Kashmir that killed 26 people. We had heard from the Pakistan Defence Minister himself that Pakistan had shut down 5 Indian planes. He's again clarifying to Bloomberg that no Indian soldiers have been taken prisoner. Right, take a look at how Asian markets are trading right now. We are not seeing a lot of movement. The Nikkei gained ground at the open coming back from a national holiday, but right now he's given up all of those gains. The Kospi also gaining about 0.5% back from holidays. This, of course, all ahead of the Fed decision, not to mention, of course, the China-U.S. trade talks this week. This is Bloomberg.
Let's take a look at how some of these big chip manufacturers are performing in Asia at the moment. We've got Samsung Electronics, SK Hynix both in positive territory. We did get some news from Advanced Micro Devices a little bit earlier on. The chip maker reporting first quarter results that beat expectations. The outlook, though, somewhat mixed. The company saying it sees an annual hit of $1.5 billion due to China export controls. AMB's did beat more broadly on its first quarter results. So let's get a little bit more on those numbers. Get to our tech reporter, Annabelle Drewlers in Hong Kong. So, Belle, what were the key takeaways here from AMD?
Yeah, I think you just sort of outlined the primary one and really what sparked a lot of the move that we saw in late trade as well, because you can see the stock now climbing or climbed around 2% into after hours trading, but actually it had taken quite a big dip of around 6%, and that was when the company was outlining, essentially, as you said, they are going to have a revenue hit this year from these China restrictions on exports of its MI308 chip to China. That's going to be to the tune of around $1.5 billion. Lisa Su, though, the CEO, she was really making the comment and trying to push back on any sort of investor fears around that, still saying the outlook is bright, even though you can see it's really playing into the share price, underperforming their peers on these concerns around tariffs. But as you said, first quarter sales beating estimates as well. And for the second quarter moving forward, they are seeing sales of around $7.4 billion, and the estimate had been for $7.23 billion. So again, it's that story of AI theme, AI optimism. It does remain intact.
Annabelle Drewlers there with the latest on the semiconductor space. This as we continue to watch geopolitics as well. Pakistan now saying it shut down 5 Indian airplanes and destroyed multiple Indian checkpoints in retaliation to Indian military strikes early Wednesday. Pakistan's defense minister, who's also spoken to Bloomberg television, now clarifying that no Indian soldiers have been taken prisoner. For more, let's bring in government reporter Sudhi Ranjan Sen in New Delhi. Sudhi, are we hearing anything from the Indian side about what's happening?
Well, from the Indian side, we've just, we are limited to just a statement that came out a couple of hours ago, which kind of said that India has struck inside Pakistan, and the targets were very were non-civilian, non-military targets. They were restricted to targets which India believes had militants in it, or militant, targets used, places where militants were staying. That's the kind of targets that India has hit. That's the only statement that we have got from India. There has been no statement either denying or confirming the jets coming down, or earlier about soldiers, whether all soldiers who took part in the operations, whether they're all safe. Similarly, we also do not know whether in this operation, whether the Indian Navy was also used to strike targets inside Pakistan. So, there is kind of an information, there's a lack of information, so to say, from India, besides, apart from the very basic information that came out a few hours ago.
Sudhi, of course, India and Pakistan have a very long history of tension around the Kashmir region. Do previous conflicts offer any guide as to how we might find an off-ramp to this conflict?
Well, yes and no. No in the sense because every conflict is different. Every conflict has its own dynamics. Every conflict has different politics around it. And yes, because, in the past we have seen government taking similar action, that is striking inside Pakistan. But those strikes were limited to disputed Kashmir, which both India and Pakistan claim simultaneously. Now, from what we are getting to understand, or from Pakistan, what we're getting to hear, it looks like there were some targets that were hit inside Pakistan. So where does that dynamic lead to? What kind of, response comes from Pakistan is going to be the key question right now. India, of course, as I was, reporting from earlier from the statement that we have seen, has very clearly said that it has stayed away. Indian strikes have stayed away, or not struck any civilian or military targets. So very clearly trying to, not to escalate the entire tension that we see. But will that work? Not yet clear.
Sudhi, we had heard that U.S. Secretary Marco Rubio was speaking to both sides after the Kashmir attack. Do we have any understanding right now of a third party involved to help these conversations?
Not really, because we have seen similar statements coming from other countries as well. We've seen statements coming from Russia. We've seen statements coming from the Gulf region, all of which kind of said that they've spoken to both sides and they would want both sides to de-escalate. Similarly, we've heard the Chinese foreign minister, after speaking to to his Pakistani counterpart, saying that our conflict between India and Pakistan is not good for the stability of this region. So the whether any country is trying to mediate or mediation is on, we are not very clear, because there is neither Pakistan nor India has come out very clearly on in their statements that we have seen.
All right, government reporter Sudhi Ranjan Sen there commenting on the escalation that we've seen today between India and Pakistan. We'll continue to keep an eye on that situation. We do have market opens in China and Hong Kong coming up at the bottom of next hour. That is it from the Asia Trade. This is Bloomberg.